One does not simply walk into Mordor. And the great eye is ever watchful.
I've been looking for an excuse to try and include Bully Maguire in this channel somewhere, and I kind of think Tobey Maguire looks a little bit like Elijah Wood. Hello guys, welcome back to Rewind Reviews and welcome if you're new. Today we're going to be travelling all the way to Middle Earth to take a look at the first instalment of the Lord of the Rings franchise, The Fellowship of the Ring. Released in 2001, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring sees Frodo Baggins from the Shire and 8 companions set out on a journey to destroy the powerful One Ring and save Middle Earth from the Dark Lord Sauron. The movie was directed by Peter Jackson and based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and adapted for screen by Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens and Peter Jackson. The movie stars Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Orlando Bloom, Sean Bean, Sean Astin, Billy Boyd, Viggo Mortensen, Cate Blanchett, Ian Holm, Christopher Lee, Dominic Monaghan, John Rhys-Davies, Liv Tyler and Hugo Weaving. Growing up there was a lot of big fantasy stories that were kind of around when I was starting to watch the TV and film. Like the biggest ones for me was Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings. I wasn't as huge on Lord of the Rings, I'm still not as much, but it is something I have always been really interested in. It is definitely a world that I am quite attached to. I do want to see more from. I'm not quite as knowledgeable in it when it comes to like Harry Potter. I'm definitely much more knowledgeable when it comes to that rather than Lord of the Rings, but it is something I am definitely interested in. And I was quite young when this movie did come out, so that's probably why I did sort of latch on to Harry Potter a little bit more, because it was kind of geared towards a slightly younger audience, whereas Lord of the Rings is a little bit more grown up. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is like aimed at adults. It is definitely a fantasy for families, and it is kind of, it does maintain that as much as it can throughout the trilogy, which is kind of something that The Hobbit struggled to do. And when it came to me actually getting to watch these movies, I only really got to see the first one when it first came out. I wasn't actually allowed to go and see the second or third one because they were 12 movies. They were definitely a lot more graphic and violent. They just were a bit too much that I wasn't really allowed to really go and see them, so I was a bit disappointed, but it was a good couple of years or so later before I actually got a chance to actually sit down and watch them. But the one thing that I never really got to do until quite recently is sit down and watch the extended editions, and that's kind of the version of the movie that I'm going to be talking about today. It's taken me almost over 20 years to actually get around to actually watching this version of The Fellowship of the Ring, but I've finally done it. I am planning on doing the extended editions of both Two Towers and Return of the King when I get around to doing those reviews. So starting off with the review for this movie, when it comes to the casting, everybody is absolutely perfect for their roles. I absolutely love who they have chosen for every single role. Everybody feels very unique and they do evoke a lot of the backgrounds of their characters, especially like the culture. Because we've got like the hobbits that we meet in Hobbiton and the Shire, who are just quite energetic and they're quite playful and quite happy a lot of the time, but then you contrast that with like the dwarves who are a bit more serious. But then we've also got like the elves as well, who are just fair and upright. And I think that every single person who they have chosen for those roles, it really works very well. I love Elijah Wood as Frodo, I love Sean Astin as Sam, I love Orlando Bloom as Legolas, and John Rhys-Davies and Viggo Mortensen as these roles, because they really bring these characters to life. They are absolutely perfect choices. But the ones that I absolutely love beyond most of the cast as well is I absolutely love some of the older actors who are part of this movie, like Christopher Lee as Saruman and Ian McKellen as Gandalf, because I just absolutely love what they do with these roles. They are so passionate about what it is that they're doing. To the point where apparently like Christopher Lee is so absorbed in the worlds that apparently he read the books pretty much every year. And when it comes to like Ian McKellen, apparently he was actually getting quite in depth into it as well, and he sort of really studied and looked into it to the point where like he sort of became a bit of a Tolkien expert on set, where they weren't quite sure on something, they sort of go for him and he'd be able to sort of tell them. They're all absolutely fantastic, and I really love what every single person is able to do with their roles, and this is a great way of introducing everyone, sort of establishing their goals and desires and sort of pushing everything forwards into what the trilogy does become. Everyone gets on really well because there's just this great chemistry between everyone. It does feel like there is definitely a friendship and a bond that does form between them as the movies do grow, especially between Legolas and Gimli, who don't really see eye to eye because like their cultures don't really sort of get on very well, but their bond starts sort of forming a little bit more in this one. I do like seeing how that progresses, and again, even like when it comes to the hobbits, like you see how close that they are, but as the movie goes on you see them getting closer and closer to the point where their friendship is completely unbreakable. I think Sean Bean gives quite an underrated performance in this as well, because I really do like Sean Bean as an actor. I do think there are some brilliant roles that he has been a part of. Kind of obvious what's going to happen if you cast him in anything these days. It is still a surprise what sort of direction they do take with him. I do like the way that his character is handled. As far as I'm aware, it is very accurate to the books. I have read the Fellowship novel. It is very accurate to that, and I do like seeing how he's the one who sort of does get manipulated by the ring, but he's also able to sort of hold off and be a bit more heroic as well, and he does get a pretty amazing sequence towards the end of this film. The dedication that Viggo Mortensen brought to Aragorn as well, it's just, I'm honestly amazed just how far he was able to really sort of go with his character's point. Well, apparently like, he was wearing the costume just around and he was just like dustying it up and kicking it around, and also just getting it to look like he'd had it for a long time. Surprised that he wasn't the first choice to play Aragorn, but he really was the perfect choice for this role. The story that this movie does portray is relatively simple, but there is a lot more. There's a lot of world building and a lot of like build up towards the events that do sort of come in the future, and it is done very well. As I say, it is very simple, it is very easy to follow. It's literally just the Fellowship's kind of coming together to destroy this one powerful ring. I don't know why I'm miming the ring when I've got one around my neck, because like this is mine, my own, my precious. It's a story that explores humanity, it explores fate as well as the quest, and as well as the power of friendship. That's one of the biggest things that this franchise has, and it doesn't really get hammered home until The Return of the King, but it really does get the formations, the foundations for it in this one. It is built up very well. The theatrical release is just brushing on 3 hours. There is a reason for that. It is quite a slow movie, it does have a very slow pace, but there is a lot going on. It is a very engaging movie. There is never a moment where you think, can you just get on with it please? You are with it all the way. I recognise the irony in me saying this because of how I felt about The Godfather, but I'm so much more invested in this story and this world. The world building that they managed to do in this is just right. It's a little bit expositional where they do sort of explain a little bit of what's going on with like the environments that they're in, like the castles and like a few of the little locations, but it makes sense within context of the movie. It does feel like this is how the characters will kind of interact and how they will talk about things. There is kind of this grand sort of feel to everything. There is history to this world. It does feel like this is an established world that's already been around before these characters existed. It is handled very well, and I do like how there are even like a few acknowledgements to The Hobbit and a few of the plot elements that happen in there, like the troll and the dragon and things like that. I can see the length putting people off. Case in point, I've met several people who don't really want to go near these movies because of how long they are. That's fair enough, but at the same time, it may be long, it may be a little dense at times, but it's worth every second. It is absolutely brilliantly done. It's one of the few 3-hour movies where it's honestly, it kind of flies by. You're engaged with the characters and the story and the world that's built up. There is a lot that is set up in this one. There's 2 main stories that they kind of focus on in this one, and that is the story with Frodo in the ring and Aragorn and his heritage. And because I've recently watched the extended versions of these movies, the one thing that I did notice is that there was a few little things here and there that did kind of jump out at me because they weren't really answered in the theatrical cut, but they are in this one. There's like a moment where Isildur, who's the guy who finds the ring in the first place, the guy who cuts it off of Sauron's hand, and it sort of explains a little bit more about what happened with him, because in the theatrical cut it says that the ring betrays him, and then it cuts to him basically just floating down a lake with arrows in his back, and you're like, what happened? In the extended cut they do actually show what it was that it meant by betraying him, and I now understand it. It sort of delves a bit more into like the Grey Havens as well, because I never really understood what that was until now. Plus all the stuff with Aragorn as well. As I said, like the main theatrical movie does focus more on the ring story, but the extended edition really sort of builds up more of Aragorn's side of things, because that is just as important going forward, because the movie kind of splits into two stories, and that's one of the biggest ones that is part of this. So it is great actually seeing a bit more of those foundations in this one, and it is built up very well, and it is great actually getting a bit of backstory and a bit of depth to who Aragorn is. And when you're watching it, you can just tell there is so much love and passion in this project for the source material. It's something that has become a bit of a struggle over the years. Even The Hobbit was a bit hit and miss here, because it just sort of felt like they were just trying to recapture what they did with The Lord of the Rings, and it didn't quite feel like it was as genuine as it really could have been. I am very interested to see what Guillermo del Toro would have done with it. I have seen a few of the concept arts here and there, and it does kind of look pretty cool, but I don't know if it would have been as good. I think there definitely would have been a lot more heart and passion in it, but I don't think that it still would have been as good as The Lord of the Rings because of what they were able to do. And as far as the story and the world goes, what they are able to set up, what they were able to establish in this movie within the franchise as a whole, including the books, this is pretty much like the definitive fantasy. This is pretty much everything that you could possibly want from a fantasy story. We've got magical MacGuffins with unlimited power, we've got magical creatures of different shapes and sizes, some of them are nice and friendly, others are big towering terrors. It's a tale of light versus dark and sorcery and swords, and this is what a fantasy is. Especially whenever somebody says what is it that you think of when it comes to a fantasy story, this is it. And this is coming from a bigger Harry Potter fan. When it comes to a lot of the creatures that do appear in this film, they are very well realised. They're incredibly brilliant how they are brought to life in this film, because there is a lot more practicality in this one than a lot of the future movies, and especially like movies that have come out today. There is a lot of makeup, there is a lot of different costumes that they've got to try and enhance things. The makeup is brilliant, and I love how it's sort of enhanced here and there with a few little special effects. It makes like the orcs, for instance, look really creepy and quite scary, and because it is practical, because it is makeup, there is so much makeup on these performers, that it does add to this very realistic tone. It does, like, even though it is a fantasy world, it does make it quite grounded. It does feel like it is something that could potentially exist in our world. I know that they are based on the designs that are talked about in the books, but like the way that these characters are realised is brilliant. I love the character designs, like all the creatures that they have, like the lake monster, and even like the Balrog. That is amazing. Everything does have an element of fantasy to it, but it is very realistic and it is believable. And because of how practical a lot of these effects are, it really does kind of give this almost like a timeless quality to it, because it still looks really good to this day. There are certain shots which I'm sort of aware of how they did, but I still don't really know how they did it, because there are scenes where we've got Bilbo and Gandalf interacting in the Hobbit hole, and there's a moment where Gandalf passes Bilbo his hat and staff, and it's all in one take, and I haven't got a clue how they do it. It's so clever. And as I said, there are definitely enhancements with CGI to sort of help with a few of these scenes, but the fact that they had to reshoot basically everything with the two different actors, it's just head-scratchingly annoying, like, just knowing just what they went through to do these scenes, because it's not just like those sequences. Most of the movie involves the two sets of people with the normal human-sized people and then the hobbits, and it's just, it is amazing how it is done. As I said, it does hold up very well. There are moments where they do look a tiny bit off, but I think that is purely just from the time. But other than that, it still looks incredible. When it comes to a lot of more CG effects, like there are definitely a lot of sequences that do implement as much as they can, but it is used very sparingly, especially compared to like what Return of the King and Two Towers did. This does rely more on the practical elements rather than the CG, but the CG is there and it looks fine. I do remember at the time it was incredible. I've never really seen anything like this before. I mean, like, yeah, Harry Potter definitely had elements to it, but that was still quite fantastical. This one definitely felt a lot more grittier and realistic, and it is still pretty good for the most part. There are definitely a lot of sequences that do hold up. There are shots of the mountain troll that are different, the cave troll, that are honestly still really good, but then there's like a few shots of Gollum, because they haven't properly introduced him yet at this point, that don't look great, but it's fine. There's a lot of detail that has gone into a lot of these different effects, especially like even like the battle sequences with how much is going on at any one time, but even like down to the more subtler things like Gandalf's magic, which is a very drastic departure from what you might expect from like a normal sort of wizard, because it is a bit more subtle. It more relies on lighting and sort of like the environment sort of reacting to him rather than like casting spells like that way. The effects overall are genuinely incredible. As I said, they are a little bit dated, but honestly most of it still does hold up, and nothing takes you out of the movie. You are so soaked up in what's going on that honestly you just don't care. I briefly mentioned the costumes a little bit earlier, so I'm just going to very quickly just talk about what they do with the different costumes that a lot of these characters have. They are very well done. The design of them is very clever. I like how they are very believable. They do borrow elements from a lot of the different cultures. Each of the characters kind of come from all the different backgrounds. Like the elves have got like sort of like long robes, well as like the wizards do as well. But then like the rangers all got sort of scuffed up with a little bit of like armour and things like that. And then the dwarves are a lot more metallic. There's a lot of detail, there's a lot of history and background that is implemented into these costumes. It does show where these characters come from. It does sell that this is a pre-established world, and it is very believable. And building off of that, we also have like a lot of the environments that they visit in this movie, all the different sets that they go to, like the Mines of Moria. The detail that has gone into this is absolutely mind-blowing, just what they were able to do, because again there is a lot of history, there is a lot of backstory that is shown, and there are stories that you could tell about all these different things, which probably might do one day, but it is there, it is already an established world, and the environments really do show that. And it's really hard not to mention the locations that they went to as well. There is definitely like this really gorgeous otherworldly side to this, because they filmed, as far as I'm aware, all of it down in New Zealand. That is the home of Middle Earth. Like those visuals of the 9 companions all together walking along the mountains, that is so iconic, and honestly you couldn't really get that anywhere else. New Zealand is the perfect choice for Middle Earth because it does have that fantasy sort of look to it, but it is a real place and it does ground it. I'm sure Lord of the Rings is meant to be like, Middle Earth is meant to like be based on, I think, like the West Midlands or something like that. I might be completely wrong on that. I think that's where it is, and that's in the UK, and I can definitely see the influence. I have visited there, I definitely do see where that inspiration comes from, but New Zealand, that is Middle Earth. That is more or less exactly what you would picture for a fantasy, and especially a fantasy this grand. When I say grand, I mean epic. Like, this is one of the first epic movies that I ever remember seeing, because it is huge. This story that they are telling just spans the entire world. It is brilliantly done. Even though most of like the big sequences are kind of kept quite small, because it is just a small group of people going up against like a really big force. The earlier stuff, like the battle against Mordor, that is almost like biblical, because of just how much is happening and this story that's being told, and the way that like when Sauron actually does appear and he's just knocking people away left, right and centre. It's so well done, it's so well realised, and it does add to the scale of this movie. This really is the definition of epic, and the action itself in this movie is absolutely brilliant. I'm still quite surprised just how brutal this actually is, especially considering this is the only movie in the Lord of the Rings franchise, like including The Hobbit, that's rated at a PG. There's decapitations, there's people getting limbs hacked off, there's all sorts going on, and it's a PG. I really do not understand how they managed to get away with it. The extended cuts are 12 as far as I'm aware, but how is this a PG? That aside, I do think that they are handled very well. They are shot very well, they're edited nicely, you can see everything. There is a lot of great sequences, like especially where the Uruk-hai are attacking the Fellowship, and there's like this one great one take sequence where you see like what Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli are getting up to, and then the camera like pans across and you see all the Uruk-hai all just swarming across these hills up towards Boromir, Merry and Pippin. It's absolutely fantastic how it's done, and especially because there's so many different characters, there is a really good balance and you can see everyone, you can see what everyone's getting up to. It doesn't try lingering on anyone in particular unless the story requires it, but it is balanced well so you get to see what everyone's doing. And there is a really great variety of action sequences in this, from the sequence just before the mines with the lake monster. You have the actual sequence within Moria where Gandalf goes up against the Balrog. So iconic, everybody knows that scene. The sequence where the Fellowship are being pursued by the Uruk-hai in their sort of last desperate attempt to try and protect the ring, plus a sequence with the Black Riders on Weathertop. Every single action sequence is visually stunning. They are so well known, they are so iconic. Every single sequence, I would argue that most people will maybe not necessarily know that they're from this, but they will have seen that imagery somewhere, and it is definitely because of this movie. There are definitely a few sequences that do kind of echo the Ralph Bakshi version of the movie, which kind of combined like the first two stories together, and there are definitely a lot of visuals that are quite similar to it, especially like the sequence on the lake when the Riders are pursuing Frodo and Narrowin. Again, it is in the books, it is a sequence that is directed from the books, but I think visually it is handled very similar. There are a lot of sequences that are quite close to the Ralph Bakshi version, like with the Black Rider where it's kind of found where the Hobbits are and it's sort of like watching over where they are, and the Hobbits are like hiding underneath a tree branch to try and get away from it. Visually it is a very eerie sequence. There are definitely a lot of horror moments in this, and that's kind of where like Peter Jackson's horror background sort of comes into play here. But there are definitely a lot of echoes from that Ralph Bakshi movie, and I do think that that did play an element into how this movie does look. This movie really does have everything in it, because it isn't just a fantasy. There is a lot of comedy, it does like brighten things up quite a bit, and it is funny. There are definitely a lot of funny moments in this, but then it's not afraid to just sort of just pelt you with just this really horrific sort of tone, and it can get quite dark at times and it can get a bit scary, especially for little kids. Speaking of experience, there are definitely moments that did kind of freak me out, especially like the sequences with the Black Riders, because they are just unnatural. They're just like this really horrible presence whenever they show up. Those sequences are really well handled. I really love what they are able to do with these characters and how they're all able to kind of shift tones whenever these characters are on screen, and it never feels out of place. There is even like a bit of a love story that is going through these as well, and again it's not as prominent as a lot of the other themes that are in this, but it is there. It is handled very nicely. There is a nice chemistry between Liv Tyler and Viggo Mortensen. They are handled really well. I like how they do perform those roles when they are together. I like how it is quite touching, their sequences together. There is a lot of history between them. It is very nice, and it is something that I do like seeing kind of built up over the future, but there's just elements that I think that I would have liked to have seen a bit more of. And even though this is a movie that I've seen a lot of times over the years, but with like this being like the first time that I've seen the extended edition, there are sequences in this that are emotional and they still do hit. They are handled so well. They really do sort of let the emotions sink in, and it can be quite an upsetting movie at times. There are definitely a few moments that will catch you off guard if you haven't seen this before. And honestly, it's just the brilliant these scenes. Honestly, I absolutely love this movie. I really love how they are able to do all these different things in this movie. This has everything that you could possibly want from a movie. But what movie would be complete without a soundtrack? And for this movie we have Howard Shore's score, and this is one of the most iconic fantasy themes in all of cinema. It really adds to the epicness of this movie with these really grand themes that really build up as the movie progresses. That shot of the Fellowship across the hills, and you've got that theme playing in the background, it's so iconic. It is one of the most iconic scenes I can think of when it comes to cinema. And all of the contrast for each environment as well, because like when it comes to like the Hobbit hole, it's very warm, it's quite lively and playful, it's just really nice, and there's like this really nice sort of flute playing in the background. It sounds beautiful, but then you contrast that with Saruman and Mordor and Isengard and all those things, and there is like this really heavy sort of like almost like an armory kind of sound to it, an industry. The music overall is absolutely great. I really love every single theme. I think every single theme is very well known. It is a very iconic soundtrack, and this is one of those rare times where it's like I can remember pretty much most of the themes in this, no problem. Overall, this is an absolutely fantastic start to this trilogy. It has become one of my favourites over the years. I've always loved it, I've always really enjoyed it, but the older I've gotten, the more I've really started to appreciate what this movie was able to do with this huge cast, this huge story that's being played out across the three movies, and the way that it builds everything up in a very believable way, and it does sort of leave everything in a very natural place to progress into the next movie. This is an absolute must watch for anyone who may not have any sort of experience when it comes to fantasy, but if you are somebody who does like fantasy, like if you've seen like Game of Thrones and things like that, please give this a go, because this is definitely one of the biggest sort of inspirations for that. Game of Thrones just kind of feels like a slightly more grown up version, but it seems more focused on like the more politics side of things and the kings and queens and things like that, whereas The Lord of the Rings is more focused on the fantasy and the world building, and for me that works better. I've always preferred Lord of the Rings to Game of Thrones. And even though, yeah, I did say a little earlier that this is definitely a family movie, this is something that families can sit down to watch and enjoy, I do think that if you are a little bit young, I'm speaking from experience here, that it might be a little bit much. I think there are definitely elements, especially in the sequels, that do sort of push what you can get away with, and I do think that it might not be suitable for every age. Honestly, this is a film, this is a franchise that is a must watch. You've got to see this at least once. The acting, the story, the effects, the props, the environments, the costumes, every single thing in this movie works so well. It is brilliant. I have said that so much throughout this review, but it is worth it. There's so much love and passion that's gone into this movie, especially with a lot of the new effects and techniques that they were kind of introducing. It is a brilliant movie. It is a fantastic start to this trilogy, and my rating for it is going to be a 10 out of 10. Honestly, this movie is really worth checking out. If you're somebody who is kind of put off by the time, I do think that just sticking with the theatrical version is fine for what it is that you want to do. But if you do want to sort of go in a bit deeper into Middle Earth and the history and all the backstory and things like that, I do think that the extended edition is definitely the superior version. So that is pretty much everything I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on this channel. I'm available on Facebook, rewindreviews.youtube, where I just post out little updates and the thumbnails that I use for these videos. If you have any thoughts on the movie, whether you like it or not, let me know down in the comments how you feel about it. Where would you rank it compared to the other two movies, or where would you rank it in the Middle Earth franchise overall? If you have any suggestions for rewind reviews in the future, whether it's film, TV, games, let me know down in the comments and I will try and get around to them one day. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Hang on a second. There we go. I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews.